The silence of a house that once echoed with laughter can break even the strongest man's heart. Harold Pemberton knew this truth intimately as he stood in the doorway of his grandfather's farmhouse. Widowed at 68 and carrying the weight of 43 years of marriage memories, his children saw only dollar signs in the rolling acres he'd inherited, prime real estate ripe for development. But Harold refused to budge on one peculiar demand. A moss-covered boulder in the center of the property must stay untouched. His grandfather had called it the soul of the land, and Harold had made a promise beneath its shadow as a boy. The family meetings grew heated. Phone calls turned bitter. His own flesh and blood labeled him a stubborn old fool clinging to worthless sentiment. When his 5-year-old granddaughter Ellie began digging around that ancient stone during what might be their final family gathering, nobody expected her tiny hands to unearth a secret that would change everything. What had his grandfather really hidden beneath that rock? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Harold Pemberton's weathered hands trembled as he turned Margaret's wedding ring between his fingers, the gold band catching the morning light that streamed through the farmhouse kitchen window. 6 months had passed since the cancer took her. 6 months since he'd last heard her gentle humming while she prepared breakfast in this very room. Now the silence pressed against his chest like a physical weight, making each breath feel deliberate and difficult. The farmhouse hadn't changed much since his grandfather Ezra's time. The same wide plank oak floors that creaked in all the familiar places. The same cast-iron stove that had warmed 3 generations of Pembertons. The same view of rolling pasture land that stretched toward the distant Blue Ridge Mountains. Harold had spent his childhood summers here, learning to milk cows and stack hay, listening to his grandfather's stories about the land and its history. Now at 68, he found himself back where it all began, seeking solace in the only place that still felt like home. Margaret always loved this kitchen, he whispered to the empty room, his voice hoarse with emotion. She had visited here with him countless times over their 4 decades together, charming Ezra with her peach cobbler and gentle laughter. She understood why this place meant so much to Harold, why the memories embedded in these walls were more precious than any inheritance his children might expect. His children. Harold's jaw tightened as he thought about Robert, Susan, and Michael, 3 successful adults who had somehow lost sight of everything their grandfather had tried to teach them about family, about roots, about the things that truly mattered in life. Robert, 45 and sharp-edged from years of corporate maneuvering, ran a struggling consulting firm in Charlotte and wore his stress like an expensive suit. Susan, 42, had built a thriving real estate empire in Asheville, but was drowning in the aftermath of a bitter divorce that had cost her half of everything. Michael, the youngest at 38, worked as a forensic accountant in Raleigh, methodical and precise, but facing mounting medical bills for his son's ongoing treatment for juvenile diabetes. Harold understood their financial pressures, he truly did. But what cut him to the bone was how quickly they had dismissed the deeper significance of this place. How eagerly they spoke of selling it to developers who would carve it into suburban lots and strip away every trace of the Pemberton legacy. The screen door's familiar squeak announced a visitor, and Harold looked up to see Emma Lou Whitman making her way up the front porch steps. At 73, she moved with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to navigate the world, despite failing eyesight. Her silver hair pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn for 30 years. She had been Ezra's closest friend and Harold's childhood confidant, the keeper of countless family stories and neighborhood secrets. "Thought I might find you brooding in here," she said, settling into the chair across from him with a soft grunt. "You've got that same look your grandfather used to get when he was wrestling with something too big for words." Harold managed a weak smile. "Just thinking about how different everything feels now. Margaret always said this place had healing in its bones, but I'm not sure anything can heal this kind of emptiness." Lou reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Grief isn't something you heal from, Harold. It's something you learn to carry. Your grandfather knew that better than most. Lost his Sarah when your daddy was just 7 years old. Raised that boy all by himself on this very farm. I remember some of those stories, Harold said, his voice growing stronger with the memories. Granddad used to tell me about the old days while we sat on that boulder out in the center pasture. Said it had been there since before the Civil War, maybe longer. Called it the soul of the land. Said it had watched over the Pemberton family through good times and bad. Lou's expression grew serious. That old rock meant more to Ezra than most folks realized. He used to say it held secrets that weren't meant for idle tongues, that it had a purpose beyond what the eye could see. The children think I'm losing my mind, Harold said bitterly. They want me to sell this place to some development company, let them tear down everything Granddad built and turn it into cookie-cutter houses. And when I told them the boulder stays untouched, they looked at me like I'd grown a second head. What exactly did you tell them? Lou asked, leaning forward with interest. Harold stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the pasture where the ancient stone sat like a patient sentinel among the grazing cattle. I told them about the promise I made to Granddad when I was 12 years old. It was the summer before he died, and we were sitting on that rock watching the sunset. He made me swear that no matter what happened, no matter who came asking or what they offered, that boulder would stay right where it was. He said the land would remember, and so would I. Lou was quiet for a long moment, studying Harold's profile against the window light. And you've kept that promise all these years. 43 years I've been gone from this place, building a life with Margaret, raising my family, working in the city. But not a day went by that I didn't think about that promise. Not a single day. Harold's voice carried the weight of decades of faithful remembrance. When the lawyer called and said I'd inherited the farm, my first thought wasn't about the money or the land value. It was about that boulder, and whether I was finally ready to understand what Granddad was trying to protect. The sound of car doors slamming in the gravel driveway interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Harold watched his eldest son Robert emerge from a black BMW, his face already set in the determined expression that meant business was about to be conducted. Susan climbed out of her silver Lexus SUV, her real estate agent instincts evident in the way she immediately began surveying the property with calculating eyes. Michael brought up the rear, consulting his smartphone and looking every inch the harried accountant. "Looks like the cavalry has arrived," Lou said dryly. "You ready for this, Harold?" Harold straightened his shoulders and tucked Margaret's ring safely into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. Ready as a man can be when his own children are about to tell him he's lost his mind. Robert's knock was brisk and businesslike, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the house like gunshots. Harold opened the door to find his 3 children arranged on the porch like a tribunal, their expressions ranging from concerned to impatient to barely concealed frustration. "Dad," Robert said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk." Susan followed, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floors. "Hello, Lou," she said with forced politeness. "I didn't expect to find you here." Harold needed some company, Lou replied evenly. "Grief has a way of making a house feel mighty empty." Michael squeezed past his siblings and gave Harold an awkward hug. How are you holding up, Dad? We've been worried about you out here all alone." "I'm managing just fine," Harold said, though the tightness in his chest suggested otherwise. "The farm keeps me busy, gives me something to focus on besides—" He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, unwilling to let them see how much Margaret's absence still devastated him. Robert had already claimed the living room, spreading papers across the coffee table with the efficiency of someone accustomed to controlling meetings. "Dad, we've been doing some research on the property values in this area. The development boom has pushed land prices through the roof. We're looking at potential offers in the range of $2.8 to $3.2 million. Susan nodded enthusiastically, pulling out her tablet to display comparable sales data. The Westbrook Development Group has been buying up parcels all through this county. They're planning a luxury residential community, executive homes, golf course, the works. They specifically mentioned your property as a key piece of their master plan. Harold felt something cold and hard settle in his stomach. And what exactly would happen to the farmhouse? To the barns? All of it would have to go, Dad, Michael said gently. I know it's hard to think about, but the structures are too old to meet modern building codes. The developers would clear the land and start fresh. Clear the land, Harold repeated slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. Everything. The oak grove where your mother and I used to walk. The creek where we taught you kids to fish. Dad, please, Robert interrupted, his tone sharpening with impatience. I know this is emotional, but we have to be practical. Susan's facing a divorce settlement that could wipe her out. My business is hanging by a thread after we lost the Morrison contract. Michael's got medical bills piling up for Jake's treatment. This sale would solve everyone's problems. Harold looked at each of his children in turn, seeing the desperation beneath their composed facades. Robert's expensive suit couldn't hide the shadows under his eyes or the tension in his jaw. Susan's perfectly applied makeup couldn't quite conceal the stress lines that had deepened since her husband's betrayal. Michael's gentle demeanor couldn't mask the worry that had become his constant companion since his son's diagnosis. I understand the financial pressures you're all facing, Harold said carefully, and if selling this place would truly help, I'd consider it. But there are conditions that can't be negotiated. What kind of conditions? Susan asked, her real estate instincts immediately alert to potential complications. Harold walked to the window and pointed toward the center of the pasture. That boulder out there stays exactly where it is. No moving it, no building around it, no disturbing it in any way. The silence that followed was deafening. Robert was the first to break it, his voice sharp with disbelief. Dad, you can't be serious. You want to derail a $3 million sale over a rock? It's not just a rock, Harold said, his voice growing stronger. It's been on this land for over a century and a half. Your great-great-grandfather Ezra made me promise to protect it, and I intend to honor that promise. Susan laughed, a sound without humor. Dad, I hate to break it to you, but developers don't design communities around random boulders. They'll move it or blast it, whatever's most cost-effective. Then there won't be a sale, Harold said firmly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Robert's face flushed red with anger. This is insane, Dad. We're talking about your children's financial survival, and you're worried about a piece of stone that's probably been dumped there by some glacier 1,000,000 years ago. Robert, Michael started, but his older brother cut him off with a sharp gesture. No, Michael. We've danced around this long enough. Robert stood and began pacing, his movements sharp and agitated. Dad, I don't know if it's the grief talking or if you're having some kind of breakdown, but this obsession with that boulder has got to stop. It's just a rock. It doesn't have feelings. It doesn't have some mystical connection to our family. It's an obstacle to our financial security, nothing more. Harold felt his own anger rising, a hot surge that reminded him he wasn't as broken as his children seemed to think. That boulder has been watching over this family longer than any of us have been alive. Your grandfather sat on it with his father. I sat on it with my grandfather. And God willing, someday your children will sit on it and learn what it means to have roots that go deeper than quarterly profit reports. What children? Robert snapped. Jake's medical bills are bleeding us dry. Sarah's college fund is gone. Susan's kids are asking why Mommy and Daddy don't live together anymore. We don't have the luxury of romantic notions about family heritage. Harold turned to face his son, and for the first time in years, Robert took an involuntary step backward. There was steel in his father's eyes that hadn't been there during the soft years of retirement and grief. You think honoring your grandfather's memory is romantic nonsense? Harold's voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of authority that had once commanded respect in corporate boardrooms. You think the promises we make to the people who raised us are just quaint suggestions we can discard when money gets tight? I think, Robert said, his own voice rising to match his father's intensity, that the dead don't pay medical bills or mortgage payments or college tuition. I think that boulder has been sitting in that field, doing absolutely nothing, for longer than anyone can remember. And if moving it can secure our family's future, then that's what needs to happen." Emma Lou cleared her throat softly. "Maybe I should head home and let you folks work this out as a family." "No," Harold said, never taking his eyes off Robert. "You stay, Emma Lou. You knew my grandfather better than anyone except me. You understand what that boulder represents." Susan stepped between her father and brother, her voice taking on the smooth, professional tone she used to diffuse tense negotiations. "Dad, I think we're all getting a little emotional here. Why don't we take a step back and look at this rationally? Even if the boulder has sentimental value, there are ways to work around it. We could have it moved to a place of honor somewhere else on the property, maybe even in the memorial garden the developers are planning." "Move it?" Harold's voice was incredulous. "Susan, that stone has been in that exact spot for longer than anyone can remember. Moving it would be like moving a gravestone or tearing down a church. Some things aren't meant to be disturbed." Michael, who had been quietly observing the escalating argument, finally spoke up. "Dad, help us understand. What exactly did Granddad tell you about this boulder? Why is its location so important?" Harold was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as he sorted through decades-old memories. "He said it was the heart of the land, that it had seen things and kept secrets that weren't meant for everyday conversation. He said that as long as that stone remained untouched, the Pemberton family would have a place to come home to." "That sounds like the kind of folklore old farmers tell their grandchildren," Robert said dismissively. "Colorful stories to make ordinary things seem special." "Maybe," Harold admitted, "but I made a promise, and I've spent 43 years keeping it. I'm not about to break it now just because you can't see past the dollar signs." The confrontation continued for another hour, voices rising and falling like storm waves, each family member taking turns, pleading, arguing, and demanding. Emma Lou sat quietly in her corner chair, witnessing the fracture of a family she had watched grow from childhood. When the shouting finally stopped, the silence was more devastating than the anger had been. Robert gathered his papers with sharp, jerky movements. "Fine, Dad. You want to throw away $3 million over a rock? That's your choice. But don't expect us to stand by and watch you destroy our children's futures because you can't let go of the past." Susan's goodbye was cooler, more professional. "Think about it, Dad. Really think about it. This offer won't wait forever, and opportunities like this don't come around twice." Michael lingered after his siblings had left, his gentle eyes filled with concern. "Dad, I know you miss Mom. I know this place holds memories that help you feel close to her. But we're your children too, and we need your help. Jake's next treatment cycle starts in 2 months, and if the insurance doesn't cover it," Harold pulled his youngest son into a fierce embrace. "I know, Michael. I know how much you're all struggling, and it breaks my heart. But some promises can't be broken, not even for the people we love most, after they had all gone." Harold and Emma Lou sat in the gathering dusk, the weight of the confrontation settling around them like dust after a storm. "You know they're not wrong about the money," Emma Lou said gently. $3 million could solve a lot of problems." Harold nodded slowly. "I know. And if moving that boulder would truly help my children, maybe I could find a way to live with breaking my promise. But something tells me this isn't really about the money." "What do you mean?" Harold stood and walked to the window again, watching the boulder's silhouette against the darkening sky. "I mean that rock has been sitting there for over a century and a half. And now, suddenly, it's the one thing standing between a development company and a multi-million-dollar project. Doesn't that strike you as oddly convenient?" Emma Lou joined him at the window, her failing eyes straining to make out the familiar landmark. "Ezra used to say that some things were meant to stay hidden until the right time came for them to be found. Maybe that time is closer than any of us realize." 2 weeks later, the sound of multiple car engines in the gravel driveway shattered Harold's morning solitude. He set down his coffee cup with a trembling hand, watching through the kitchen window as his 3 children emerged from their vehicles alongside 2 strangers in expensive suits. The strangers moved with the predatory confidence of people accustomed to getting what they wanted, their polished shoes crunching on the gravel as they surveyed the property with calculating eyes. Harold's heart hammered against his ribs as he recognized the manila folder in Robert's hand, the same thick legal document that had been the subject of countless phone calls over the past fortnight. The developer's contract, the piece of paper that would transform everything his grandfather had built into another sterile subdivision with names like Heritage Oaks or Pemberton Estates, as if slapping the family name on a mailbox could somehow preserve the soul of a place. The knock came at exactly 9 o'clock, sharp and businesslike. Harold opened the door to find his family flanked by their corporate allies, the morning sun glinting off the brass buttons of the lead developer's navy blazer. "Dad," Robert said, his voice carrying the false warmth of someone trying to close a deal, "I'd like you to meet James Westbrook from Westbrook Development and his associate, Patricia Chen, their lead acquisition specialist." Westbrook stepped forward with practiced charm, his smile revealing teeth too white and too perfect. "Mr. Pemberton, it's an honor to meet you. Your family has spoken very highly of this beautiful property." His handshake was firm, but somehow cold, like grasping an expensive tool rather than another human being. Patricia Chen nodded respectfully, her sharp eyes already cataloging every detail of the farmhouse interior. "We're very excited about the potential this land represents. Mr. Pemberton, your property is the cornerstone of what could be the most prestigious residential development in the county." Harold stepped back to allow them entry, his stomach churning with a mixture of dread and anger. "Coffee's fresh if anyone wants some," he offered, falling back on the ingrained hospitality his grandfather had taught him, even as his world prepared to crumble around him. The group settled around the kitchen table, the developers spreading glossy brochures and architectural renderings across the scarred wooden surface that had hosted 3 generations of family meals. Westbrook launched into his presentation with the enthusiasm of a revival preacher, his manicured hands gesturing at images of pristine houses and perfectly landscaped streets. "What we're proposing, Mr. Pemberton, is nothing short of transformational," Westbrook said, his voice rich with conviction. "Pemberton Estates will be a gated community of luxury homes, each one designed to complement the natural beauty of this region. We're talking about executive-level residences starting at $800,000, with premium lots going for well over $1 million. Susan leaned forward eagerly, her real estate instincts engaged. The property values for the entire area would increase dramatically. Even neighboring farms would see their worth double or triple within 5 years. Harold stared at the renderings, trying to reconcile the sanitized perfection on paper with the living, breathing landscape outside his window. In the artist's conception, the rolling pastures had been replaced by curved streets and identical driveways. The old oak grove, where he and Margaret had shared countless evening walks, was now a community green space with geometric flower beds and a decorative gazebo. "Where's the boulder?" Harold asked quietly. The question landed in the middle of Westbrook's sales pitch, like a stone thrown into still water. The developer paused, his smile flickering for just a moment before reasserting itself with renewed intensity. "I'm sorry?" Westbrook said, though his expression suggested he had heard the question perfectly well. "The boulder in the center pasture," Harold repeated, his voice growing stronger. "It's not shown in any of these drawings. Where does it go in your plan?" Patricia Chen consulted her tablet, swiping through digital files with efficient precision. "According to our geological survey, there is indeed a large stone formation approximately 300 yards southwest of the main house. Our site preparation team has already calculated the removal costs. It's a fairly straightforward procedure." "Removal costs," Harold repeated, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. Westbrook nodded enthusiastically. "Nothing to worry about, Mr. Pemberton. We have specialized equipment for dealing with natural obstacles. That particular stone would be relocated to our materials yard, where it could be broken down for use in decorative landscaping throughout the community. Very sustainable, very environmentally conscious. The room seemed to tilt around Harold as the full implication of those words sank in. They weren't just planning to move his grandfather's sacred stone, they intended to destroy it completely, grinding it into fragments to decorate their artificial paradise. "No," Harold said, the word emerging from somewhere deep in his chest. Robert's jaw tightened with frustration. "Dad, please, let's hear the full offer before—" "No," Harold repeated, louder this time. "That boulder stays exactly where it is." Westbrook's smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered in his eyes. "Mr. Pemberton, I understand that long-time residents often have sentimental attachments to natural features. That's why we're prepared to offer additional compensation for any inconvenience the site preparation might cause." He slid a check across the table, the amount written in bold blue ink that seemed to glow under the kitchen lights. $50,000, just for the right to destroy a piece of stone that had watched over the Pemberton family for generations. Harold stared at the check without touching it, feeling a rage build inside him that he hadn't experienced since his army days. "Mr. Westbrook, that boulder has been on this land since before your great-grandfather was born. It's not an inconvenience or an obstacle, it's part of the soul of this place." Patricia Chen leaned forward with the patient expression of someone explaining a complex concept to a child. "Mr. Pemberton, with respect, it's just a rock. A very large, very expensive to relocate rock. But at the end of the day, it's simply an impediment to what could be a truly magnificent community development. Just a rock," Harold whispered, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "My grandfather spent hours on that rock, teaching me about responsibility and keeping faith with the land. My father proposed to my mother beside that rock. Margaret and I," his voice cracked with emotion, "Margaret and I spread a blanket next to that rock for our first picnic when I brought her home to meet Granddad. That rock has been witness to every important moment in this family's history, and you call it just a rock." The silence that followed was deafening. Harold could see the calculation in Westbrook's eyes, the internal debate about whether to push harder or try a different approach. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly caught between his financial desperation and his dawning realization of what this sale truly meant to his father. Susan broke the silence with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to navigating emotional negotiations. "Dad, I know the boulder has sentimental value, but we're talking about $2.8 million plus the $50,000 bonus. Even if you used half that money to have the stone professionally relocated to a place of honor somewhere else on the property." "Relocated where?" Harold interrupted, his voice sharp with pain. "To some corner lot between house number 47 and the community mailboxes? Turned into a decorative centerpiece for someone's driveway?" Michael spoke up for the first time since the meeting began, his voice gentle but strained. "Dad, Jake's treatment is scheduled to start next month. The new therapy costs $18,000 per session, and insurance will only cover 60%. If we don't have the money—" Harold's heart broke a little more as he looked at his youngest son's haggard face. Michael had aged 10 years in the past 6 months, the stress of his son's illness carving lines of worry around his eyes and mouth. The unfairness of it all, that a grandfather should have to choose between his sacred promise and his grandson's health, nearly overwhelmed him. "I know about Jake's treatment," Harold said softly, "and I would give every dollar I have to make sure that boy gets what he needs. But breaking my promise to Granddad won't solve anything. It'll just create new problems we can't even imagine yet." Westbrook sensed weakness and moved in for the close. "Mr. Pemberton, I can see this is an emotional decision for you. Perhaps we could sweeten the arrangement. $3 million even, plus the $50,000 bonus. Plus we'll have that boulder relocated to any location you specify within a 5-mile radius. Professional movers, cushioned transport, the works. You could even visit it whenever you wanted." Harold stood slowly, his legs shaking with the effort of containing his rage. "Get out, Dad!" Robert started. "I said get out." Harold's voice filled the kitchen with the authority of a man who had commanded respect in boardrooms and on battlefields. "All of you, I want these people off my land, and I want you three to take a long, hard look at what you're asking me to do." Westbrook remained seated, his composure unruffled. "Mr. Pemberton, I understand you need time to process this offer, but I should mention that opportunities like this don't remain open indefinitely. Market conditions change, development priorities shift. This offer expires in 7 days. 7 days, Harold repeated, the words heavy with threat. Patricia Chen nodded crisply. "That's standard in our industry. We have other properties under consideration, and we can't afford to have capital tied up in extended negotiations." Harold walked to the kitchen door and held it open, his message unmistakable. 7 days to destroy everything my grandfather built. 7 days to turn the soul of this land into gravel for your driveways. 7 days to break a promise I've kept for 43 years. He fixed each of his children with a stare that burned with disappointment and betrayal. "I hope the money's worth it." Robert's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "Dad, you're being completely unreasonable. We're trying to help you, trying to secure your future as well as ours." "My future is right here," Harold said firmly. "On this land with that boulder, keeping faith with the people who came before me. If you can't understand that, then maybe you never really knew me at all." Susan gathered her papers with sharp, jerky movements, her professional mask slipping to reveal raw frustration underneath. "Fine, Dad. You want to throw away $3 million over sentimental nonsense. That's your choice. But don't expect us to stand by and watch you ruin everyone's life, because you can't accept that times change." The developers left with polite but cold farewells, already calculating their next move. Harold watched their expensive cars disappear down the gravel driveway, followed by his children's vehicles. The silence they left behind was deeper than any he had known, even in the darkest days after Margaret's death. He walked slowly to the center pasture, his legs feeling heavy as lead. The boulder sat exactly where it had always been, its moss-covered surface warm from the morning sun. Harold lowered himself onto the familiar stone, feeling the rough texture through his jeans, remembering countless afternoons spent in this exact spot with his grandfather. "I kept my promise, Granddad," he whispered to the wind. "But I don't know how much longer I can hold on. They're my children, and they're hurting, and they think I'm choosing a rock over their families." The boulder offered no answers, only the solid, patient presence it had maintained for generations. Harold closed his eyes and tried to remember his grandfather's exact words from that summer afternoon so many years ago, searching for some clue about why this promise was so important, why this particular piece of stone was worth destroying his relationship with his own children. But all he could remember was the feel of his grandfather's weathered hand on his shoulder, and the solemn weight of a 12-year-old boy's oath, sworn in the golden light of a summer evening when the world seemed full of infinite possibilities and the future stretched ahead like an unwritten story. Now, sitting alone on the same stone, Harold wondered if keeping that promise would cost him everything else he held dear. 7 days to decide between honoring the past and securing the future. 7 days to choose between his grandfather, his legacy, and his children's desperate needs. 7 days to determine whether some promises were worth the price of keeping them. The first 3 days passed in a silence so profound that Harold began to question whether his family still existed at all. No phone calls broke the stillness of the farmhouse. No text messages chimed on the cell phone Michael had insisted he carry. Even the familiar hum of traffic on the county road seemed muffled, as if the world itself was holding its breath while he wrestled with an impossible choice. On the 4th morning, Harold found himself climbing the narrow stairs to the farmhouse attic, driven by a restlessness he couldn't name. The wooden steps creaked under his weight with the same familiar protests they had made since his childhood, each groan a note in the symphony of memory that filled every corner of this place. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight that streamed through the single dormer window. illuminating boxes and trunks that held the accumulated treasures and forgotten remnants of 3 generations. His grandfather's belongings occupied the far corner, exactly where Harold's father had placed them after Ezra's funeral 43 years ago. Time had added layers of dust and the musty smell of age, but nothing had been disturbed. Harold's hands trembled as he opened the first trunk, revealing carefully folded clothes that still carried the faint scent of pipe tobacco and Old Spice aftershave. There, nestled between a stack of flannel shirts and a collection of Reader's Digest magazines, Harold's fingers found something unexpected, a carved wooden pipe, its bowl worn smooth by decades of use. He lifted it with the reverence of someone handling a religious relic, turning it over in his palms and feeling the weight of countless conversations that had taken place while Ezra puffed thoughtfully on this very instrument. The sight of that pipe broke something loose in Harold's chest, releasing a flood of memories that had been dammed up by years of city living and the gradual drift away from his rural roots. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice, patient and measured, explaining the mysteries of farming and life, while blue-gray smoke curled around his weathered features. "The land doesn't belong to us, Harold," Ezra had said during one of their evening sessions on the boulder. "We belong to the land. We're just caretakers, passing through for our little span of years, trying not to mess things up too badly for the folks who come after us." Harold sank onto an old wooden crate, clutching the pipe and feeling the full weight of his grandfather's philosophy pressing down on him like a physical force. How had he forgotten these conversations? How had the demands of career and family and modern life pushed these fundamental truths so far into the background that they had nearly disappeared altogether? A soft knock at the front door pulled him back to the present. Harold made his way downstairs, expecting perhaps a neighbor or the mail carrier, but found Emma Lou standing on the porch with a covered casserole dish and the expression of gentle concern. "Thought you might be getting tired of your own cooking," she said, following him into the kitchen without waiting for an invitation. "Also thought you might need someone to talk to who remembers what it was like when promises meant something." Harold accepted the dish gratefully, breathing in the comforting aroma of Emma Lou's famous chicken and dumplings, the same recipe she had been perfecting for 50 years. "I found Granddad's pipe in the attic," he said, showing her the carved wooden artifact. "Funny how holding something like this can bring a person back so completely." Emma Lou settled into her familiar chair at the kitchen table, her eyes soft with recognition. "Ezra never went anywhere without that pipe. Even when the doctor told him to quit smoking, he kept it with him, claimed it helped him think better." She paused, studying Harold's face with the practiced eye of someone who had witnessed decades of human struggle. "What did it help you remember?" Harold turned the pipe over in his hands, feeling the smooth grooves worn by his grandfather's fingers. Things he used to say about being caretakers instead of owners, about how the land has its own memory, its own way of holding on to the important things. He looked up at Emma Lou with eyes that held the confusion of a man caught between worlds. "But I keep thinking about Jake's medical bills and Robert's business troubles and Susan's divorce. Real problems that need real solutions, not philosophy and folk wisdom. Who says they have to be separate things?" Emma Lou asked quietly. "Your grandfather was one of the most practical men I ever knew, but he also understood that some things can't be measured in dollars and cents." Harold set the pipe on the table between them and rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of 4 sleepless nights. "Tell me about the boulder, Emma Lou. Tell me what you really know about why it was so important to him." Emma Lou was quiet for a long moment, her gnarled fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table surface. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the gravity of someone sharing secrets that had been carefully guarded for decades. "Ezra never told me everything," she began, "but I know that boulder meant more to him than just a place to sit and watch the sunset. He used to say it had been there since before the war, not Vietnam or Korea, but the big one, the Civil War, said his grandfather had told him stories about soldiers camping near that stone, about things that got buried and forgotten when the fighting moved on. Harold felt a chill run down his spine, despite the warmth of the kitchen. "What kind of things?" "I don't know for certain," Emmylou admitted. "But I remember one night, must have been 15 years ago, when Ezra had a bit too much whiskey and started talking about keeping faith with the dead. He said that boulder was like a gravestone, marking something that couldn't be moved or disturbed without consequences." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Harold stared out the kitchen window toward the pasture where the ancient stone sat in its eternal vigil, and felt a new understanding begin to crystallize in his mind. Perhaps his grandfather's protective instincts hadn't been based on simple sentiment after all. Perhaps there were practical reasons, grounded in history and respect for the past, that demanded the boulder remain untouched. Did he ever say what might happen if it was disturbed? Harold asked. Emmylou shook her head slowly. "No, but I got the impression that he didn't want to find out. Some doors are better left unopened, some questions better left unasked. Your grandfather was a God-fearing man, but he also understood that the world holds mysteries that aren't meant for everyday folks to poke around in." Harold stood and walked to the window, his gaze drawn to the boulder as if by magnetic force. From this distance, it looked perfectly ordinary, just a large stone sitting in a field of grass, unremarkable except for its size and the moss that gave it a greenish tinge in the afternoon light. But now, armed with Emmylou's revelation, he began to see it differently, not as an obstacle to development, but as a guardian of secrets that might be better left undisturbed. "The developers want to destroy it completely," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Break it up for landscaping material. Turn it into decorative gravel for their fancy driveways." Emmylou's intake of breath was sharp and audible. Lord have mercy. Ezra would roll over in his grave if he knew someone was planning to desecrate that stone. Harold turned back to face her, his expression hardening with resolve. "Then I can't let it happen. No matter what it costs me with my children, no matter how much money we're talking about. I can't break faith with Granddad and whatever he was trying to protect." But even as he spoke those words with conviction, Harold felt his heart breaking a little more. 3 days remained until Westbrook's deadline expired. 3 days to find a way to honor his grandfather's legacy without destroying his relationship with his children. 3 days to discover whether keeping faith with the past was worth sacrificing the future. That evening, as Harold sat alone in the gathering dusk, he made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of his usual chair on the front porch, he walked out to the center pasture and lowered himself onto the boulder, feeling its solid warmth against his back as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "I need to understand," he whispered to the stone beneath him. "I need to know what you're really protecting, what Granddad was so afraid of losing. Help me find the strength to do the right thing, even if it means losing everything else." The boulder offered no answers, only the patient silence it had maintained for generations. But as Harold sat there in the darkness, surrounded by the sounds of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle, he felt something shift inside him, a quiet certainty that some promises were worth keeping regardless of the cost, and some secrets were meant to be protected even from those we love most. The pipeline to his grandfather's wisdom might have been clouded by years of neglect, but it hadn't been broken. Tomorrow, Harold decided, he would begin the process of truly understanding what Ezra Pemberton had entrusted to his care all those years ago. Tomorrow, he would start fighting for something bigger than money or convenience or even family harmony. Tomorrow, he would begin fighting for the soul of the land itself. The basement of the farmhouse had always felt like a different world to Harold. Darker, cooler, filled with the earthy scent of stone foundation and the accumulated mysteries of decades. He had avoided it since returning to the farm, partly because the steep wooden steps were harder on his aging knees, but mostly because basements held the kind of forgotten things that could ambush a grieving man with unexpected memories. Now, Driven by a desperate need to understand his grandfather's secrets, Harold descended into that shadowy realm with a flashlight in one hand and Emma Lou's revelations echoing in his mind. The single bulb that hung from the ceiling cast harsh shadows across the cluttered space, revealing shelves lined with canning jars, boxes of Christmas decorations, and tools that had waited patiently for hands that would never use them again. In the farthest corner, behind a stack of paint cans and a collection of fishing rods, Harold discovered something he had never noticed before: a wooden chest, smaller than the trunks in the attic, but built with the same careful craftsmanship that characterized everything Ezra Pemberton had touched. The leather hinges creaked with age as Harold lifted the lid, releasing the scent of old paper and the faint aroma of pipe tobacco that seemed to permeate everything his grandfather had owned. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from decades of basement moisture, Harold found a leather-bound journal. The cover was worn smooth by handling, and the brass clasp that held it closed bore the patina of age and countless openings. With trembling fingers, Harold carried it upstairs to the kitchen table, where the afternoon light would allow him to read his grandfather's carefully penned words. The first entry was dated June 15th, 1962, just 2 years after Harold's birth, and written in the precise handwriting that had filled out countless seed orders and cattle breeding records. The boy Harold visited today with his parents. Watched him climb on the guardian stone like I did when I was small, like my father did before me. Time I started thinking about what to tell him, how much he needs to know when he's old enough to understand. Some secrets are too heavy for young shoulders, but every generation needs its keeper. Harold's breath caught in his throat. Guardian stone. His grandfather had never used that term in conversation, had always simply called it the boulder or the old rock. But here, in the privacy of his own thoughts, Ezra had given it a name that carried weight and purpose. He flipped through the journal, finding entries scattered across the years, each one adding pieces to a puzzle that was slowly taking shape in Harold's mind. Some entries were brief, almost cryptic. Walked the boundary today. Stone still secure. No signs of disturbance. The watchers remain undisturbed in their rest. Others were longer, more reflective. Harold asked me today why the stone was important. Told him it was the soul of the land, which is true enough for a boy his age. But someday he'll need to know the real truth, that some ground is sacred not because of what grows on it, but because of what lies beneath it. The guardian stone marks more than just the center of our property. It marks the center of a promise made in blood and kept in silence for nearly a century. Harold's hands shook as he turned the pages, each entry revealing new layers of mystery that his grandfather had carried alone for decades. The entries became more frequent in the months before Ezra's death, as if the old man had sensed his time was running short and felt the urgent need to record everything he knew. The cancer is getting worse. Doctor says I have maybe 6 months, probably less. Need to prepare Harold for what's coming. But Lord knows how to explain something like this to a 25-year-old who thinks the world runs on logic and modern thinking. How do you tell someone that their inheritance comes with obligations that go deeper than property taxes and maintenance schedules? Talk to Harold today about keeping promises, about honoring the commitments made by those who came before us. Made him swear on the guardian stone that he would protect it no matter what. Saw something in his eyes, the same thing I saw in my own father's face when he made me swear the same oath. The weight of responsibility, the understanding that some things matter more than convenience or profit. The final entry was dated just 3 days before Ezra's death. Harold has grown into a good man. Married that sweet Margaret girl, started a family of his own. Part of me wants to tell him everything now, while I still have the words to say it. But maybe it's better this way. Maybe each generation only needs to carry the burden it's strong enough to bear. The guardian stone will wait. It's been waiting for over 100 years. It can wait a little longer for the right time to reveal its secrets. Harold closed the journal and sat in the gathering darkness. feeling the full weight of his grandfather's unspoken trust settling around his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Whatever lay beneath that boulder, whatever secret the guardian stone had been protecting all these years, Ezra had deemed it significant enough to carry to his grave, rather than burden his grandson with knowledge that might prove dangerous or overwhelming. The phone's shrill ring shattered the silence, making Harold jump in his chair. The caller ID showed Michael's number, and Harold answered with a mix of hope and trepidation. "Dad?" Michael's voice was strained, exhausted. "I'm at the hospital with Jake. His blood sugar spiked again, and they want to keep him overnight for observation." Harold's heart clenched with helpless love for his grandson, the bright 7-year-old who had inherited his mother's gentle nature and his father's quiet determination. "Is he okay? Do you need me to come?" "He's stable now, but Dad—" Michael's voice cracked with emotion. "The doctors want to start the new treatment protocol next week. The one that costs $18,000 per session. Insurance is balking, saying it's experimental. If we don't have the money—" Harold closed his eyes, feeling the terrible weight of competing loyalties crushing down on him like a physical force. On one side, his grandfather's journal and the mysterious obligations it hinted at. On the other, his grandson's desperate need and his son's breaking heart. "Michael—" Harold started, then stopped, unable to find words that could bridge the chasm between duty and love. "The Westbrook offer expires tomorrow," Michael said quietly. "Robert called their office today. They're willing to extend the deadline by 24 hours if you'll just meet with them one more time. Dad, I'm begging you. I know the boulder means something to you, but Jake means everything to me." Harold opened his eyes and stared at his grandfather's journal, its leather cover seeming to pulse with the weight of secrets that demanded protection. "I'll think about it," he whispered, the words feeling like betrayal, even as he spoke them. "Thank you," Michael said, relief evident in his voice. "Dad, I know this is hard. I know you made a promise to Granddad, but sometimes circumstances change and we have to adapt. Even promises have to bend sometimes when the stakes are high enough." After the call ended, Harold sat alone in his kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of his grandfather's words and the echo of his son's desperate plea. 3 generations of Pemberton men, each one faced with impossible choices, each one trying to balance the weight of the past against the needs of the present. He opened the journal again, searching for some guidance, some hint about what Ezra would have wanted him to do in this situation. On the very last page, in handwriting that was shakier and less certain than the earlier entries, Harold found words that seemed to speak directly to his current dilemma. If the time comes when keeping the secret costs more than revealing it, if the guardian stone becomes a burden too heavy for one man to bear alone, remember this: some truths are meant to be discovered, not hidden forever. The stone has been waiting. Maybe it's been waiting for someone brave enough to uncover what lies beneath. Someone strong enough to handle the consequences of disturbing what was meant to stay buried. But choose carefully, and choose with full knowledge of the cost. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Harold closed the journal and walked to the window, gazing out at the guardian stone in the moonlight. Tomorrow, Westbrook's deadline would expire. Tomorrow, he would have to choose between his grandfather's cryptic obligations and his family's desperate needs. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether some promises were sacred enough to keep, even when keeping them meant watching the people he loved most suffer the consequences. The boulder sat in its eternal vigil, offering no guidance, no easy answers. Just the patient silence of something that had waited for over a century and was prepared to wait a century more. But Harold was only human, and his heart was breaking with the weight of loving too many people across too many generations to ever satisfy them all. Harold woke before dawn with the journal clutched against his chest, having fallen asleep in his grandfather's old recliner while wrestling with the impossible decision that tomorrow would demand. His neck ached from the awkward position, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional weight that pressed down on him like a stone slab. Today was the last day of Westbrook's extended deadline. Today, he would have to choose between his grandfather's mysterious legacy and his family's survival. The kitchen felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, filled with shadows that seemed to whisper accusations and pleas in equal measure. Harold made coffee with shaking hands, spilling grounds on the counter as he tried to focus on the simple ritual of morning preparation. Through the window, he could see the guardian stones silhouetted against the lightening sky, patient and immutable as always. By 7 o'clock, he had read through his grandfather's journal twice more, searching for some clue that might make his decision easier. But Ezra's words only deepened the mystery, hinting at secrets that demanded protection while offering no concrete explanation of what those secrets might be. The old man had been careful, even in his private thoughts, to avoid specifics that might prove dangerous if discovered by the wrong eyes. The sound of a car engine in the driveway made Harold's stomach clench with anticipation and dread. Through the window, he watched David's pickup truck come to a stop near the front porch, followed by Susan's silver Lexus. His daughter and son-in-law climbed out of their vehicles with the grim expressions of people preparing for a difficult conversation. But it was the small figure that emerged from the back seat of the truck that made Harold's heart skip a beat. Ellie bounced up the porch steps with the irrepressible energy of a 5-year-old. Her blonde curls catching the morning light and her face bright with the uncomplicated joy that only children possess. She wore a pink sundress decorated with butterflies and carried a small purple backpack that seemed almost as large as she was. "Grandpa Harold!" she called out, launching herself into his arms as he opened the door. "Daddy said we could visit the farm today. Can I see the cows? Can I feed the chickens?" Mommy packed snacks. Harold held his granddaughter close, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence. For a moment, the weight of his impossible choice lifted slightly, replaced by the simple pleasure of holding someone who loved him without conditions or complications. "Of course, you can see the cows. Sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "they've been asking about you." David approached with the careful demeanor of a man walking through a minefield. At 38, Susan's ex-husband had maintained his relationship with Harold despite the divorce, understanding that some bonds transcended the legal dissolution of a marriage. His weathered hands and sun-darkened skin spoke of years spent in construction work, building the kinds of honest, practical things that lasted for generations. "Morning. Harold," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Hope you don't mind us dropping by unannounced." Susan thought maybe Ellie could spend some time with her grandpa while we... He paused, glancing towards Susan, who was organizing papers in the front seat of her car with the focused intensity of someone preparing for battle. "While you try to talk some sense into the stubborn old man," Harold finished with a bitter smile. "I understand, David. You're all worried about me. Worried about the money. Worried about making the wrong choice." Susan approached with her arms full of real estate documents and her expression set in the professional mask she wore when difficult negotiations were required. "Dad, we need to talk. Westbrook called yesterday afternoon. They've had another property come available, the Hendricks Farm, over in Madison County. If we don't give them an answer today, they're moving on to Plan B." Harold looked down at Ellie, who was tugging on his hand and pointing toward the pasture where the cattle grazed peacefully in the morning sun. "Grandpa, look! The cows are having breakfast just like us." The simple observation struck Harold like a physical blow, reminding him of all the morning conversations he had shared with his grandfather in this very spot. All the life lessons that had been passed down through generations of quiet observation and patient wisdom. How could he explain to this bright, innocent child that her grandfather was being asked to destroy the very foundation of everything their family had built? "Dad," Susan continued, her voice taking on the patient but firm tone she used with difficult clients, "I know the boulder has sentimental value, I remember sitting on it when I was Ellie's age, listening to your stories about Granddad and the old days. But sentiment doesn't pay medical bills or college tuition. Jake needs treatment that costs more than most people's annual salary. And Robert's business is hanging by a thread. Harold knelt down to Ellie's level, looking into her bright blue eyes that held no knowledge of the adult complications swirling around her. "Sweetheart, would you like to go exploring while the grown-ups talk? There's a big rock out in the pasture that your mommy used to play on when she was your age." Ellie's eyes widened with excitement. "A real adventure rock? Can I climb on it?" "You can do whatever feels right," Harold said, the words carrying more weight than a 5-year-old could possibly understand. "Just be careful, and remember that some things have been waiting a long time for the right person to discover them." David offered to accompany Ellie to the pasture, understanding that Harold and Susan needed privacy for the conversation that was about to unfold. Harold watched them walk hand in hand toward the guardian stone, his granddaughter chattering excitedly about butterflies and wildflowers, while David listened with the patient attention of a man who understood the value of childhood wonder. "She's beautiful," Harold said softly, tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. "So much like her mother at that age, curious about everything, fearless in the face of the unknown." Susan's professional facade cracked slightly, revealing the worried daughter beneath. "Dad, she's also like her mother in that she needs stability, security. The divorce has been hard on her. She asks why she can't live with both her parents anymore, why Daddy has a different house now. If we could just get through this financial crisis, maybe David and I could—" She stopped herself. Unwilling to voice hopes that might prove futile, Harold turned to face his daughter fully, seeing past the real estate agent's polished exterior to the frightened woman who was trying to hold her fractured world together through sheer force of will. "Is that what this is really about? Not just the money, but the chance to put your family back together?" Susan's composure finally cracked, and tears began to flow down her carefully made-up cheeks. "I made such a mess of everything, Dad. I was so focused on building my business, on proving that I could be successful in a man's world, that I forgot what really mattered. By the time I realized what I was losing, it was too late. David had already moved out, already started building a life without me." Harold pulled his daughter into his arms, feeling her shoulders shake with the weight of accumulated regret and exhaustion. For a moment, they were no longer a stubborn grandfather and a desperate real estate agent. They were simply a father and daughter, connected by bonds that transcended business deals and financial pressures. "If the money from this sale could give you a chance to rebuild what you lost," Harold said quietly, "then maybe I've been thinking about this all wrong. Maybe keeping a promise to the dead isn't worth destroying the hopes of the living." Susan pulled back, searching her father's face with hope and disbelief. "Dad, are you saying—" "I'm saying I need to understand all the costs before I make my decision," Harold replied, his gaze drifting toward the pasture, where Ellie was now sitting on the guardian stone, her small hands exploring its moss-covered surface with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Your grandfather left me more than just a farm and a promise. He left me a responsibility to protect the things that matter most." "And what matters most?" Susan asked, following his gaze toward her daughter. Harold was quiet for a long moment, watching Ellie trace patterns in the moss while David stood nearby, ready to catch her if she lost her balance. "Family," he said finally. "Family matters most. Everything else, the land, the money, even the promises we make to the dead, they're only valuable if they serve the living." But even as he spoke those words, Harold felt his grandfather's journal burning like a weight in his shirt pocket. Its cryptic warnings about doors that couldn't be closed and truths that demanded protection. Whatever secret the guardian stone held, Ezra had believed it was important enough to carry to his grave. Was Harold really prepared to risk unleashing something unknown and potentially dangerous just to solve his family's financial problems? From the pasture, Ellie's voice carried on the morning breeze, high and clear, and filled with the kind of wonder that adults spend their lives trying to recapture. "Daddy, look! There's something shiny under the rock. Can we dig it up? Harold and Susan exchanged glances, both of them suddenly focused on the small figure kneeling beside the guardian stone. David was bending down now, examining whatever had caught Ellie's attention, his expression shifting from casual interest to sharp curiosity. "Maybe we should see what she's found," Susan said. Her real estate instincts immediately alert to the possibility of complications. Harold nodded, but his movement toward the pasture was reluctant, weighted down by the growing certainty that his 5-year-old granddaughter was about to change everything, whether he was ready for that change or not. Harold's legs felt unsteady as he and Susan made their way across the pasture, the morning dew soaking through his work boots and the weight of approaching revelation pressing down on his chest like a physical force. With each step toward the guardian stone, he could feel the threads of his carefully ordered world beginning to unravel, pulled loose by the innocent curiosity of a 5-year-old child who had no understanding of the secrets she might be disturbing. Ellie was on her hands and knees beside the massive boulder, her small fingers working at something in the earth with the focused determination that only children possess when they discover something truly fascinating. David knelt beside her, his expression shifting from amused tolerance to genuine concern as he examined whatever had caught her attention. "Dad, you need to see this," David called out, his voice carrying a gravity that made Harold's stomach clench with apprehension. "Ellie's found something that looks deliberate, intentional, like someone buried it here on purpose." Harold approached the stone slowly, each footstep feeling like a betrayal of his grandfather's trust. 43 years of faithful promise-keeping, 43 years of protecting a secret he didn't fully understand. And now, a child's innocent exploration was about to expose everything Ezra had worked so hard to keep hidden. "Look, Grandpa Harold," Ellie exclaimed, her face bright with discovery. "There's a corner of something metal sticking up right here by the big rock. Daddy says it might be treasure." Harold knelt beside his granddaughter, his weathered hands shaking as he brushed away the loose soil she had disturbed. There, just visible beneath a thin layer of earth and moss, was the unmistakable corner of a metal container, something rectangular and purposeful, clearly placed rather than accidentally dropped or naturally deposited. Susan stood behind them, her real estate agent's mind immediately calculating the implications. "Dad, if there's something of value buried here, it could complicate the sale. Archaeological finds, historical artifacts, these things can tie up property transfers for months, sometimes years." Harold ignored his daughter's concerns, his attention focused entirely on the metal corner that seemed to pulse with significance in the morning light. His grandfather's journal had hinted at things that got buried and forgotten when the fighting moved on, and now here was physical evidence that those cryptic references might have been more than just old. "Man's folklore. We should stop," Harold said quietly, though his own curiosity burned like a fever in his chest. "We should cover this back up and pretend we never saw it." "But Grandpa," Ellie protested, her lower lip jutting out in the universal expression of childhood frustration, "we can't stop now. It might be pirate treasure, or maybe it's from the olden days when people had to hide their special things." David looked up at Harold with the measured expression of a man who understood that some discoveries carried consequences far beyond their immediate significance. "Harold, I know this is your decision to make, but if there's something historical here, something that predates the property surveys and development rights, it could change everything about how this land can be used." Harold closed his eyes, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on him. His grandfather's voice seemed to whisper from the pages of the journal, warning about doors that couldn't be closed once opened, about truths that demanded protection until the right time came for their revelation. But what if this was that time? What if his granddaughter's innocent discovery was exactly the kind of divine intervention that Ezra had been waiting for? "What do you think, Dad?" Susan asked, her voice gentler now, understanding that they stood at the threshold of something that transcended real estate transactions and family finances. "What would Granddad have wanted us to do?" Harold opened his eyes and looked at each face in turn, David's patient concern, Susan's worried hope, and Ellie's bright expectation. 3 generations gathered around the guardian stone, each one representing different needs and different understanding of what this moment might mean. "Your great-great-grandfather left me a promise to keep," Harold said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of 4 decades of faithful service. "But maybe promises aren't just about keeping things hidden forever. Maybe sometimes they're about knowing when the right time comes to let the truth emerge." He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew his grandfather's journal, its leather binding warm from resting against his heart. "Ezra wrote something in here near the end about the stone waiting for someone brave enough to uncover what lies beneath. I always assumed that meant I was supposed to prevent anyone from disturbing it. But what if I was wrong? What if the guardian stone has been waiting for exactly this, for family to discover it together, for the right circumstances to make revelation necessary?" Ellie bounced on her knees with excitement. "So we can dig it up? We can see what's inside?" Harold looked at his granddaughter's eager face, seeing in her features an echo of every Pemberton who had ever sat on this stone and wondered about the mysteries it protected. "Yes, sweetheart, I think we can dig it up, but carefully, respectfully, understanding that some discoveries change everything that comes after." David retrieved a small folding shovel from his truck while Susan used her phone to document their position and take photographs. Her real estate training instinctively creating a record that might prove valuable if legal complications arose. Harold and Ellie worked together to clear away the soil, their 4 hands moving in harmony as they gradually revealed the edges of what appeared to be a military ammunition box. Its olive green paint faded but still recognizable. "It's heavy," Harold observed, as they finally freed the container from its earthen resting place. The metal felt solid and substantial in his hands, and he could hear something shifting inside when he tilted it slightly. "Whatever's in here, someone went to considerable trouble to protect it." The box bore no visible markings except for a series of numbers stenciled on one side. Numbers that meant nothing to Harold, but which seemed to carry significance beyond their mundane appearance. A simple metal clasp held the lid closed, secured by a small padlock that had long since succumbed to rust and corrosion. "Can we open it now?" Ellie asked, her excitement barely contained. Harold looked around the circle of faces, each one reflecting their own mixture of anticipation and apprehension. They had crossed a line from which there would be no return, had committed themselves to whatever truth lay hidden in this weathered container. His grandfather's warnings echoed in his mind, but stronger still was the sense that this moment had been inevitable from the instant Ellie's curious fingers had first brushed away the concealing soil. "We'll open it together," Harold said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "But first, we need to understand that whatever we find might change how we see this place. Might change decisions we thought were already made." Susan nodded slowly, her earlier urgency about the Westbrook deadline seeming less important in the face of whatever revelation awaited them. "Dad, are you saying this could affect the sale?" Harold hefted the ammunition box, feeling its weight both physical and metaphorical. "I'm saying that some discoveries have a way of rearranging priorities, of making us realize that what we thought we wanted isn't necessarily what we actually need." David stood and brushed soil from his knees, his expression thoughtful. "Harold, maybe we should take this inside, open it in private where we can examine whatever's inside without worrying about curious neighbors or unwanted attention." "Good thinking," Harold agreed, rising with the container clutched protectively against his chest. "Some family business is better handled away from prying eyes." As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Ellie skipping ahead with the boundless energy of a child who had just participated in her first real adventure, Harold felt the weight of his grandfather's legacy shifting in his hands. Whatever secrets this box contained, whatever truths Ezra had deemed too dangerous or too precious to trust to idle conversation, they were about to become part of the living world again. The guardian stone watched them go with its eternal patience. Having finally surrendered the treasure it had protected for generations. But Harold suspected that the real test of his promise-keeping was just beginning. That opening this box would demand choices far more difficult than simply refusing to sell the land to developers. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again, and some family legacies carried obligations that money could neither buy nor satisfy. The kitchen table that had hosted 3 generations of family meals now held the weight of a secret that could rewrite the entire Pemberton legacy. Harold set the ammunition box in the center of the scarred wooden surface, its olive-green paint seeming to absorb the afternoon light that streamed through the windows. The rust-weakened padlock had surrendered to David's wire cutters with surprising ease, as if even metal and time understood that the moment for revelation had finally arrived. Ellie stood on a kitchen chair, her small hands pressed flat against the table as she leaned forward with barely contained excitement. "It's like Christmas morning," she whispered, her voice filled with the kind of wonder that adults spend their lives trying to recapture. "Except better because we found the present ourselves." Susan had positioned herself where she could photograph whatever they discovered, her real estate instincts still operating even as her deeper curiosity took control. David stood behind Harold's shoulder, ready to offer support if the contents proved overwhelming or disturbing. The weight of approaching truth pressed down on all of them like the heavy air before a thunderstorm. Harold's weathered hands trembled slightly as he lifted the ammunition box's lid, the metal hinges creaking with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed kitchen. The smell that emerged was musty and old, but oddly preserved, as if the container's military construction had protected its contents from the decades of moisture and decay that claimed most buried treasures. The first thing Harold saw was a layer of oiled cloth, wrapped around something rectangular and substantial. Beneath that, he could make out the edges of documents, the glint of metal objects, and what appeared to be a small leather pouch tied with string. But it was the top item that made his breath catch in his throat, a folded piece of paper with his own name written in his grandfather's careful handwriting. "Harold," the inscription read, "for when the time comes, that keeping this secret costs more than revealing it." Harold's hands shook as he unfolded the letter, recognizing immediately the formal tone his grandfather had used for important occasions, wills, property transfers, and the kind of serious conversations that marked the passage of responsibility from one generation to the next. "My dear grandson," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means that circumstances have forced you to disturb the guardian stone, despite my warnings, or that enough time has passed for wisdom to overcome caution. Either way, the decision to reveal what follows has been yours to make, and I trust that you have chosen correctly." Harold's voice wavered as he read aloud, but he continued, understanding that this moment belonged to the entire family gathered around the table. "The contents of this box represent more than a century of Pemberton family secrets, but they are not our secrets alone. In 1863, during the darkest days of the Civil War, a Union paymaster's wagon was ambushed on the road that once ran through our property. The soldiers carrying $15,000 in gold coins, payment for an entire regiment, were killed in the attack, but they managed to hide their cargo before they died." Susan gasped audibly, her photographer's hands frozen in mid-motion. David moved closer, his expression shifting from curiosity to stunned understanding. Ellie looked from one adult face to another, sensing the gravity of the moment without fully comprehending its implications. Harold continued reading, his grandfather's words painting a picture of desperate men making desperate choices in desperate times. "The Confederate raiders who attacked the wagon searched for hours but never found the gold. Local farmers discovered the bodies 3 days later, and my grandfather, your great-great-grandfather, William Pemberton, helped bury the dead soldiers with full military honors in the small cemetery behind what is now the Methodist Church. But William had seen where one of the dying soldiers had crawled, had followed the blood trail to the base of the great boulder that sits in the center of our land. There, buried in a shallow grave marked only by scratches on the stone itself, he found the Union gold, enough money to buy half the county, enough wealth to transform our family's fortunes forever. Harold paused, his throat dry with the implications of what he was reading. Around the table, 3 generations of Pembertons waited in stunned silence for him to continue. William faced a choice that has haunted our family ever since, Harold read. He could claim the gold as spoils of war, could use it to expand our holdings and secure our future, or he could recognize that the money belonged to soldiers who died serving their country, that taking it would be no different from robbing graves or stealing from the dead. William chose honor over fortune. He left the gold where the soldiers had hidden it, but he moved their makeshift grave to a place of greater protection. The guardian stone became their memorial, and our family became their guardians. For over a century, we have protected not just hidden treasure, but the final resting place of men who died far from home in service to their beliefs. Harold set the letter aside and carefully unwrapped the oiled cloth package, revealing a collection of items that told the story his grandfather's words had begun. There were photographs, brown with age, showing uniformed soldiers posed stiffly for formal portraits. There were military documents, commissions and orders, bearing official seals and signatures. There was a small Bible, its leather binding cracked but still intact, with names and dates inscribed on the inside cover. And there, at the bottom of the box, wrapped in its own piece of protective cloth, was a leather pouch that chinked with metallic weight when Harold lifted it. Inside, he found not the fortune his grandfather's letter had described, but a small collection of gold coins, perhaps a dozen pieces, enough to represent the larger treasure without comprising its security. Sample pieces, Harold murmured, understanding immediately. Granddad kept these as proof, as evidence that the story was real, but left the main treasure where the soldiers hid it. David leaned forward, his construction worker's practical mind immediately grasping the implications. Harold, if there's really $15,000 in Civil War gold buried under that boulder, we're not talking about historical curiosity. At today's precious metal prices, plus the numismatic value, we could be looking at a fortune that makes the Westbrook offer look like pocket change. Susan's real estate instincts were racing ahead to complications and opportunities. Dad, this changes everything about the property rights, about what we can and can't do with the land. If there are Union soldiers buried under that stone, if there's a significant archaeological site, it changes nothing. Harold interrupted, his voice carrying a finality that surprised even himself. Don't you understand what Granddad is telling us? This isn't about the money. It never was about the money. It's about honor, about keeping faith with men who died believing they had hidden their regiment's pay where it would be safe from Confederate raiders. Ellie, who had been listening with the intense concentration that children reserve for stories they don't fully understand, but somehow recognize as important, spoke up with the clear logic that only comes from innocence. Grandpa Harold, if the soldier boys hid their money to keep it safe, and if they're sleeping under the big rock, then we shouldn't wake them up, should we? Harold felt tears spring to his eyes as his granddaughter's simple wisdom cut straight to the heart of the matter. No, sweetheart, we shouldn't wake them up. They've been resting peacefully for over 150 years. And they deserve to keep resting. But even as he spoke those words, Harold could see the calculation in his children's faces, the desperate weighing of honor against necessity that had driven his family to the brink of financial ruin. $15,000 in Civil War gold, properly authenticated and sold, could indeed solve every problem they faced. Jake's medical bills, Robert's business debts, Susan's divorce settlement, all of it could be swept away by a treasure that had been waiting patiently beneath them. Guardian stone for someone brave enough or desperate enough to claim it. The silence that followed was heavy with competing loyalties and impossible choices. Outside, the afternoon shadows were lengthening across the pasture where the guardian stone stood sentinel over its hidden charges. Inside, a family struggled with the weight of a secret that was simultaneously a blessing and a curse, a solution and a moral test that would define who they truly were when stripped of all pretense and pressed to their breaking point. Harold picked up his grandfather's letter and read the final paragraph aloud. His voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks. "The choice is yours now, Harold, just as it was William's over a century ago. You can claim the treasure and solve your family's immediate problems, or you can continue to guard the honor of men who trusted their final sacrifice to strangers who became their eternal protectors. Either choice carries consequences that will echo through generations. Choose with full knowledge that some decisions, once made, can never be unmade." The ammunition box sat open between them, its contents spread across the table like pieces of a puzzle that had taken 3 generations to solve. The real treasure, Harold realized, was not the gold that lay buried beneath the guardian stone, but the test of character that gold represented, the eternal question of whether honor was worth more than fortune, whether promises to the dead carried more weight than the desperate needs of the living. Tomorrow, Westbrook's deadline would expire. Tomorrow, Harold would have to give his final answer about selling the land. But tonight, surrounded by the evidence of his family's secret guardianship, he had to decide whether he was willing to break faith with sleeping soldiers to save his children's futures. Some choices, his grandfather had warned, could never be unmade. Harold was beginning to understand that some choices were also too important to make alone. The night passed without sleep for Harold Pemberton. He sat in his grandfather's old recliner, the ammunition box's contents spread across the coffee table like evidence in a trial, where he was simultaneously judge, jury, and defendant. The Civil War photographs stared back at him in the lamplight, young faces frozen in sepia tones. Men who had died believing their sacrifice would mean something, that their final act of hiding the regiment's pay would serve some greater purpose than enriching the raiders who had killed them. By dawn, Harold had read his grandfather's letter so many times that he could recite it from memory. But the words offered no easy answers, no clear path through the moral wilderness that stretched before him. The sample gold coins clinked softly in his palm as he turned them over, their weight both substantial and symbolic. 12 pieces of history, worth perhaps $10,000 at current prices, representing a treasure that could transform his family's future or damn their souls, depending on the choice he made in the next few hours. The phone rang at 7:30, jolting Harold from his tortured contemplation. Robert's number appeared on the caller ID, and Harold answered with the weariness of a man who had wrestled with angels all night and emerged without victory. "Dad, I've been thinking all night about what we found yesterday," Robert said, his voice carrying an urgency that Harold had rarely heard from his eldest son. "I called a friend who deals in Civil War artifacts. If we're really talking about $15,000 in Union gold from 1863, properly documented and authenticated, we could be looking at anywhere from $2 to $5 million at auction." Harold closed his eyes, feeling the weight of temptation pressing down on him like a physical force. $5 million, enough to solve every financial problem his family faced, enough to secure Jake's medical future, enough to rebuild Susan's shattered life, enough to save Robert's failing business, with money left over for generations of Pembertons yet unborn. "And what about the soldiers buried under the stone?" Harold asked quietly. "What about the promise our family has kept for over a century?" Robert's pause was telling, the silence of a desperate man grappling with moral complications he couldn't afford to acknowledge. "Dad, I understand the historical significance. I respect what great-great-grandfather William did, the honor he showed in not taking the gold originally. But circumstances change. The Civil War ended 160 years ago. Those soldiers have been honored and remembered. Now it's time to think about the living." Harold opened his eyes and stared at the photographs spread before him. trying to reconcile his son's practical arguments with the faces of men who had died trusting that their sacrifice would be protected by strangers who became their guardians. "Robert, if we dig up that gold, we're not just taking money. We're desecrating a grave site, disturbing the final resting place of men who died in service to their country. Dad, please." Robert's voice cracked with emotion. "Jake's next treatment cycle starts Monday. The insurance company denied coverage yesterday. They're calling the new therapy experimental, non-essential. Without that $18,000, my grandson could—" He stopped, unable to voice the possibility that haunted every parent of a chronically ill child. Harold felt his resolve wavering like a candle flame in a strong wind. The abstract concept of honoring long dead soldiers seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the immediate reality of a 7-year-old boy who needed medical care that his grandfather could provide with a few hours of careful excavation. The sound of car engines in the driveway interrupted his agonizing internal debate. Through the window, Harold watched Susan and David arrive, followed closely by Michael's sedan. The grim expressions on their faces told him that yesterday's discovery had prompted family discussions that had continued long into the night. Conversations about moral obligations and desperate necessities that had probably resolved nothing and satisfied no one. Emma Lou emerged from her own car, moving with the careful dignity of someone who had lived long enough to understand that some family crises required the wisdom of neutral observers. Harold realized that Susan must have called her, understanding instinctively that decisions of this magnitude needed witnesses who could remember when honor was more important than expedience. The kitchen filled with the weight of unspoken tensions as Harold's children and their allies arranged themselves around the table where the ammunition box still held court over its revelations. Michael looked haggard, his gentle features marked by sleepless worry. Susan's professional composure had cracked, revealing the desperate mother underneath. Even David, who had no blood stake in the Pemberton legacy, seemed burdened by the moral complexity of their situation. "We need to make a decision," Michael said without preamble, his voice steady but strained. "Westbrook's deadline expires at 5 o'clock today. If we're going to refuse their offer, we need to have a plan for dealing with our financial obligations." Emma Lou settled into her customary chair, with the careful movements of someone conserving energy for important battles. "Before anyone makes any decisions, I think you should know that I spent yesterday evening making some phone calls of my own. Old friends, people who might remember stories their grandparents told about the Civil War years in this county." Harold looked up sharply, sensing that Emma Lou's research might complicate an already impossible situation. "What did you find out?" Emma Lou opened her worn leather purse and withdrew a manila folder, its contents suggesting hours of careful documentation. "I found out that your great-great-grandfather William wasn't the only one who knew about those Union soldiers. There were other witnesses, other families who helped with the burial, other people who kept the secret for over a century." She spread photocopied pages across the table, newspaper clippings from the 1920s and 1940s, obituaries that mentioned cryptic references to wartime secrets and promises kept to sleeping heroes, church records that showed donations made anonymously every year on the anniversary of the ambush, historical society minutes that referenced attempts to identify Confederate raiders who had desecrated the memory of Union dead. "The point is," Emma Lou continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had done her homework, "this secret doesn't belong just to your family. It belongs to this community, to the descendants of everyone who helped protect those soldiers' final resting place. If you decide to disturb that grave, you're not just breaking faith with your grandfather. You're betraying the trust of an entire community that has kept this secret for generations." Susan's real estate instincts immediately grasped the implications. "You're saying that other people know about the gold? That if we try to excavate it, word will spread throughout the county?" Emma Lou nodded grimly. I'm saying that secrets this old and this significant don't stay buried just because one family decides to dig them up. If you disturb that stone, within a week every treasure hunter, journalist and government official in 3 states will be camped on your property. The money you think you'll gain will disappear in legal fees, archaeological surveys, and federal investigations. The silence that followed was deafening. Harold felt a mixture of relief and disappointment wash over him. Relief that the practical obstacles might remove the moral burden of choice. Disappointment that his family's financial salvation might be slipping away through legal complications he hadn't anticipated. Robert leaned forward, his businessman's mind immediately working through contingencies. But if we don't pursue the gold, if we keep it secret and just sell the land to Westbrook, won't the developers disturb the site anyway when they clear for construction? Harold felt his heart clench with renewed anguish. He had been so focused on the choice between claiming the treasure and honoring the dead that he had forgotten the original dilemma that had brought them to this point. Selling the land to Westbrook would accomplish the same desecration he was trying to prevent, would turn the Guardian stone and its sleeping charges into gravel for suburban driveways. That's exactly why Granddad made me promise to protect the stone, Harold said slowly, the full scope of his responsibility finally becoming clear. It wasn't just about keeping the gold safe from treasure hunters. It was about keeping the entire site safe from anyone who would disturb it for any reason. David, who had been quietly observing the family's struggle, finally spoke up. Harold, what if there's a third option? What if we don't have to choose between the money and the memorial? All eyes turned to the construction worker, whose practical experience with land development had taught him to think creatively about seemingly impossible situations. What do you mean? Harold asked. David pulled out his phone and began sketching on a napkin, his rough hands surprisingly skilled at architectural drawing. I mean, what if we approach this differently? Instead of seeing the Civil War site as an obstacle to development or a source of quick money, what if we saw it as the foundation for something that could honor both the dead and the living? He turned the napkin toward the group, revealing a rough sketch of the property with the Guardian stone at its center, surrounded by carefully planned structures that worked around the memorial rather than destroying it. A Civil War interpretive center, a place where people could come to learn about the local history, to understand the sacrifices made by soldiers on both sides of the conflict. Museums like this, done right, can generate significant ongoing revenue while preserving the historical integrity of the site. Susan's eyes widened as her real estate experience processed the possibilities. Dad, he's right. A historically significant property, properly developed for educational tourism, could be worth more in the long run than either the Westbrook deal or the gold itself. Michael nodded slowly, his accountant's mind already working through financial projections. The initial development costs would be significant, but there are grants available for historical preservation projects, tax incentives for educational institutions. If we could document the site properly, prove its historical significance, we could solve our financial problems while honoring the promise Granddad made us keep, Harold finished, feeling hope kindle in his chest for the first time since this crisis had begun. But even as the possibilities took shape around the kitchen table, Harold knew that the hardest part still lay ahead. Convincing Westbrook to withdraw their offer would be difficult. Convincing the County Historical Commission to support their vision would take time and political skill they might not possess. Convincing his children to embrace a long-term solution instead of immediate. Financial relief would require faith in a future that was far from guaranteed. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked, steadily toward 5 o'clock. Each second bringing them closer to a deadline that would determine not just the fate of the Guardian stone, but the character of the Pemberton family for generations to come. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and Harold couldn't help but wonder if they were approaching the calm before the storm, or the storm itself at 4:30 in the afternoon, with 30 minutes remaining until Westbrook's deadline. Harold stood in the center pasture beside the guardian stone, his entire family gathered around him in a circle that seemed to represent both unity and fracture. The storm clouds that had been building all day hung low and threatening, casting the landscape in shades of grey that matched the weight of the decision pressing down on all of them. Ellie sat cross-legged on the grass beside the ancient boulder, her small hands tracing the moss-covered patterns while she hummed a tune that seemed to emerge from some deep well of childhood contentment. She alone among them seemed untroubled by the magnitude of the choice they faced. Secure in the knowledge that whatever the adults decided, her world would continue to hold wonder and possibility. "We have to make this decision now," Robert said, his voice tight with the strain of holding competing loyalties in balance. "In less than half an hour, I have to call Westbrook and give them our final answer. Are we taking their offer, or are we walking away from $3 million to chase David's dream of a historical center that may never happen?" Harold looked at each face in turn, seeing the fear and hope and desperation that had brought them to this moment. Michael stood with his arm around Susan's shoulders, both of them bearing the weight of children who needed stability and security that only money could provide. David held Emma Lou's elbow, supporting her as she gazed at the guardian stone with eyes that had witnessed 8 decades of human folly and occasional wisdom. Even the cattle in the distance seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, standing motionless as they watched the human drama unfold beneath the darkening sky. "Before we make this choice," Harold said slowly, "I need to tell you something that Emma Lou helped me understand last night. This decision isn't just about us. It's not just about our family's financial problems or even about honoring the soldiers buried beneath this stone. It's about what kind of people we choose to be when everything we value is at stake." He reached into his pocket and withdrew the leather pouch containing the sample gold coins, their metallic weight solid and tempting in his palm. "These 12 coins represent the easy choice, the choice to take what we need and justify it however we can. But they also represent the hard choice, the choice to trust that doing the right thing will somehow lead to the right outcome, even when we can't see how that's possible." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to spatter against the guardian stone's moss-covered surface. Harold felt the moisture on his face like tears from the sky itself, as if the heavens were weeping for the difficulty of the choice that lay before them. "Dad," Susan said, her voice breaking with emotion, "I want to do the right thing. I want to honor great-great-grandfather William's choice and protect these soldiers' memory. But Ellie needs security. She needs to know that her college education is paid for, that if something happens to me or David, she'll be taken care of. How do I choose between honoring the dead and protecting my daughter's future?" Harold knelt beside his granddaughter, who looked up at him with eyes that held no judgment, no desperate need for him to choose correctly. "Ellie, sweetheart, do you remember the story I told you about promises? About how sometimes keeping a promise costs more than we want to pay, but we keep it anyway because that's what good people do?" Ellie nodded solemnly. "Like when I promised Mommy I wouldn't eat cookies before dinner, even when I was really hungry and the cookies smelled really good. Exactly like that," Harold said, his voice thick with love for this child who understood moral complexity better than most adults. "Sometimes we have to choose between what we want and what we promised, and it's hard, but we try to make the choice that makes us proud of who we are." Michael stepped forward, his accountant's precision evident even in this emotional moment. "Dad, I've been running numbers all day. If we pursue David's interpretive center idea, we're looking at 18 months minimum before any revenue stream begins. Jake's treatment can't wait that long. Without insurance coverage, we need that $18,000 by Monday morning." The weight of his grandson's medical crisis pressed down on Harold like a physical force. 7 years old, fighting a disease he didn't understand, trusting the adults in his life to make choices that would keep him safe and healthy. How could Harold weigh the honor of dead soldiers against the immediate needs of a living child who shared his blood and his love? Emma Lou's voice cut through his anguish like a beacon in the storm. "Harold, there's something else I need to tell you. Something I discovered this morning when I called my friend at the County Historical Commission." She reached into her purse and withdrew a thick envelope, her weathered hands shaking slightly as she opened it to reveal official-looking documents bearing county seals and formal letterhead. When I described what we had found, what we suspected about the Civil War connection, they immediately sent over preliminary paperwork for historical site designation. If we can prove that Union soldiers are buried beneath that stone, this entire property becomes protected under state and federal preservation laws. Harold felt his heart skip a beat as the implications became clear. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," Emma Lou continued, her voice carrying a mixture of triumph and concern, "that no private development company can touch this land. No subdivisions, no golf courses, no shopping centers. But it also means that any excavation, any attempt to recover buried artifacts or remains, has to be done through official archaeological channels with full government oversight." Susan's real estate instincts immediately grasped the legal ramifications. "You're saying that if we document this site, we can prevent Westbrook from developing it, but we also lose any chance of accessing the gold ourselves?" Emma Lou nodded grimly. "The government doesn't allow private individuals to profit from archaeological discoveries on historically significant sites. If there really is Union gold buried here, it becomes federal property the moment we file these papers." The silence that followed was broken only by the increasing intensity of the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Harold stared at the documents in Emma Lou's hands, realizing that she had inadvertently presented them with the very solution he had been seeking, a way to honor his promise to his grandfather, while ensuring that the Guardian Stone and its secrets would be protected forever. But that protection came at a cost that might prove too high for his family to bear. No Westbrook money, no buried treasure, no quick solution to their financial crisis. Just the satisfaction of doing the right thing and the hope that somehow, somewhere, they would find another way to meet their obligations to the living. "How long do we have to decide?" Harold asked, his voice barely audible above the sound of rain against stone. Emma Lou consulted the documents. "The preliminary designation takes effect immediately upon filing. Once I submit these papers, the property is protected, but any claims to private ownership of archaeological discoveries are permanently waived." Robert looked at his watch, his expression grim. 20 minutes until I have to call Westbrook. 20 minutes to choose between $3 million and a historical designation that leaves us exactly where we started, except with the government's guarantee that we'll never be able to solve our financial problems by developing or excavating this land. Harold stood slowly, feeling every one of his 68 years settling into his bones like the approaching storm. The choice had crystallized into perfect clarity: honor and permanent financial struggle, or betrayal and temporary monetary relief that would solve their immediate problems while damning their souls. The Guardian Stone sat patient and eternal in the gathering rain, its moss-covered surface darkening with moisture as it had for over a century, waiting for Harold Pemberton to decide whether the promises made by dead men were worth more than the desperate needs of the living. Around him, 3 generations of his family waited in the storm, each one carrying burdens that only his decision could lift or make permanent. In 20 minutes, Harold would have to choose not just the fate of his family's legacy, but the kind of man he truly was when stripped of all pretense and pressed to his absolute breaking point. The rain was falling harder now, turning the pasture grass dark and slippery beneath their feet as Harold's phone began to ring in his pocket. The caller ID showed Westbrook's number, 5 minutes early, but Harold could hear the impatience in the electronic tone, the corporate world's inability to wait even the full measure of time they had demanded. "Don't answer it yet," Michael said urgently, stepping closer to his father. "Dad, I need you to know something before you make this call." I talked to Jake's doctors this morning, explained our situation. They're willing to work with us on a payment plan, even without insurance coverage. It won't be easy, but it's possible. Harold looked at his youngest son with surprise and gratitude. Michael, why didn't you tell us this earlier? Michael's face was tight with emotion, rain mixing with tears on his cheeks. Because I wanted to see what choice we'd make when we thought we had no other options. I wanted to know if our family would choose honor or money when we believed everything was at stake. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. Through the rain, Harold could see car headlights approaching on the county road, probably Westbrook himself, coming to collect his answer in person rather than trusting to telephone conversations that could be misunderstood or manipulated. Susan pulled Ellie close, sheltering her daughter from the worst of the downpour. Dad, whatever you decide, we'll support it. But you need to know that we've all been talking and we've been thinking about this wrong from the beginning. What do you mean? Harold asked, his thumb hovering over the phone's answer button. Robert stepped forward, his expensive suit darkened with rain, but his posture straighter than Harold had seen it in months. We've been acting like we're victims of circumstances, like we have to choose between impossible options because life backed us into a corner. But Emma Lou made us realize something important. We're not the first generation of Pembertons to face this choice, and we won't be the last. Emma Lou's voice carried clearly despite the storm. Your great-great-grandfather William faced the same decision in 1863, when taking that gold could have set his family up for generations. Your grandfather Ezra faced it every day for 80 years, knowing he could solve any problem by disturbing that stone. And now it's your turn, Harold. Not just to make a choice, but to make the choice that defines what the Pemberton name means. Harold's phone buzzed with a text message from Westbrook. Final answer required now. Car in driveway in 2 minutes. Through the rain, Harold could see the black BMW turning into his driveway, its headlights cutting through the grey afternoon like searching eyes. The moment of choice had arrived, with the inexorability of weather and time, demanding an answer that would echo through generations. Emma Lou, Harold said quietly. Give me those historical designation papers. Emma Lou handed him the envelope, her weathered face showing no surprise at his decision. Harold took the documents and looked at each face gathered around the guardian stone. His children, his granddaughter, his oldest friend. 3 generations of Pembertons and the woman who had helped guide them all toward this moment of truth. Before I file these papers, Harold said, I need each of you to understand what this choice means. We're not just protecting dead soldiers or honoring old promises. We're choosing to believe that doing the right thing matters more than solving our problems the easy way. We're choosing to trust that somehow, if we have the courage to honor our obligations to the past, the future will take care of itself. Ellie tugged on his coat sleeve, her young voice clear and certain despite the storm. Grandpa Harold, are the soldier boys buried under the rock? Harold knelt beside his granddaughter, looking into eyes that held no fear of financial ruin or social judgment. Only the clear moral vision that comes before the world complicates everything with practical considerations. Yes, sweetheart. They're buried there, and they've been waiting a very long time for people to remember them. Then we can't move the rock, Ellie said with 5-year-old certainty. When people are sleeping, you don't wake them up, unless it's really, really important. And money isn't as important as letting people sleep peacefully, Harold felt his heart break and heal simultaneously as his granddaughter's words cut through every rationalization and justification he had tortured himself with over the past week. Out of the mouths of babes came the wisdom that adult complexity had obscured. Some things were simply right or wrong, regardless of consequences. The BMW's doors slammed in the driveway, and Harold could hear Westbrook's voice calling through the rain, demanding answers that would determine the fate of everything his family had built over 5 generations. Harold stood slowly, the historical designation papers protected inside his jacket. His decision made not by careful calculation, but by the moral clarity of a child who understood that disturbing, the sleep of the dead, was wrong. Regardless of the living's desperate needs, Emmylou, he said with quiet finality, file the papers. Protect this site forever. Dad, are you sure? Susan asked, though her voice carried relief rather than disappointment. Harold looked around the circle of faces one last time, seeing in each of them the reflection of choices made and values honored despite the cost. I'm sure some promises are worth keeping even when keeping them costs us everything we thought we wanted. He pulled out his phone and answered Westbrook's call, his voice steady despite the storm raging around them. Mr. Westbrook, Harold Pemberton, I'm calling to officially decline your offer. This land is not for sale at any price. The silence on the other end was telling, followed by Westbrook's sharp response. Mr. Pemberton, I'm standing in your driveway in the rain. Surely we can discuss. There's nothing to discuss, Harold interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had finally chosen his path and would not be turned from it. This property is being designated as a historical site. It will never be available for private development. Through the rain, Harold could see Westbrook's figure gesticulating angrily beside his car. But the distance and the weather reduced his protests to meaningless noise. The developer climbed back into his BMW and drove away, with the aggressive speed of a man unaccustomed to being told no, his taillights disappearing into the grey afternoon like retreating artillery. As the family stood in the rain beside the guardian stone, Harold felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he was carrying. The financial problems remained. The medical bills still demanded payment. The business struggles would continue to test his children's resolve. But something fundamental had been settled. Some question about the Pemberton family's character had been answered in a way that would resonate through generations yet unborn. Emmylou was already on her phone with the Historical Commission, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had waited 8 decades to see justice done. The guardian stone would be protected forever, its sleeping charges safe from disturbance. The promise made by William Pemberton in 1863 finally and permanently fulfilled. Harold gathered his family around him in the rain, feeling the presence of all the Pembertons who had come before and all who would come after. Some promises were indeed worth keeping, regardless of cost, and some choices, once made with honor and courage, created their own rewards in ways that money could never buy. 6 months later, Harold stood in the morning sunshine beside the guardian stone, watching the construction crew put the finishing touches on the Pemberton Civil War Memorial Center. The modest building had been designed by David's architectural firm to complement rather than dominate the landscape, its weathered brick and timber construction echoing the farmhouse, while creating a dignified space for visitors to learn about the local history that had been hidden for over a century. And the morning air carried the scent of fresh lumber and new paint, mixed with the eternal perfume of grass and wildflowers that had graced this pasture since Harold's childhood. The boulder itself remained exactly as it had always been, moss-covered and patient, but now it was surrounded by a carefully designed memorial garden that honored the Union soldiers buried beneath without disturbing their eternal rest. Ellie came running across the pasture, her hair flying behind her as she clutched a handful of wildflowers she had picked for the memorial's dedication ceremony. At nearly 6 years old, she had appointed herself the key, unofficial guardian of what she still called the sleeping soldier boys, visiting the site almost daily to ensure that their resting place remained peaceful and undisturbed. Grandpa Harold, she called out, launching herself into his arms with the fearless enthusiasm that had never dimmed despite all the adult complications of the past year. Look what I found. Purple flowers for the soldier boys. Mama says purple is the color of courage. Harold held his granddaughter close, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence that had somehow survived the family's financial struggles and moral testing. The past 6 months had not been easy. Jake's medical bills had indeed required a payment plan that stretched Michael's budget to its limits. Robert's business had required a second mortgage on his house to survive, and Susan's divorce settlement had left her starting over from scratch. But somehow, in ways that Harold was only beginning to understand, their choice to honor the sleeping soldiers had opened doors that greed and desperation had kept locked. The historical designation of the property had attracted the attention of Civil War scholars and preservation societies throughout the region. Grant money had become available for the Memorial Center's construction, and the National Park Service had provided both expertise and funding for the archaeological survey that had confirmed what the Pemberton family had known for generations. Beneath the Guardian stone lay the remains of 7 Union soldiers, identified through military records and personal effects that had been carefully preserved by more than a century of patient earth. The soldiers had been reinterred with full military honors in the new memorial garden, their sacrifice finally receiving the recognition that had been denied them in the chaos of war. The ceremony had drawn hundreds of visitors, including descendants of other Civil War soldiers, who had found meaning and closure in this long-delayed tribute to men who had died far from home in service to their beliefs. Lou approached from the direction of the farmhouse, moving with the careful dignity of someone who had lived long enough to see justice done and promises kept. At 74, she had become the Memorial Center's volunteer historian, her decades of careful record-keeping and community connections proving invaluable in documenting the site's significance and attracting educational tourism to the region. The dedication ceremony starts in an hour, she said, settling onto the bench that David had built beneath the old oak tree. Channel 12 is here to cover the story, and the State Tourism Board wants to include the memorial in their Civil War Trail brochure. Harold nodded, still amazed by the attention their small act of honor had generated. What had begun as a simple choice to protect a family secret had evolved into something much larger, a testament to the power of keeping faith with the past and trusting that doing the right thing would somehow create its own rewards. Susan emerged from the Memorial Center's front door, her business suit replaced by the comfortable jeans and blazer that had become her uniform since she had accepted the position as the center's executive director. The divorce had been finalized, but instead of the devastation she had feared, it had opened space for her to rebuild her relationship with David and discover that some love affairs were worth fighting for a second time. "Dad, the museum director from Richmond just called," she said, her voice bright with excitement. "They want to loan us 3 pieces from their Civil War collection for our permanent exhibit, and the Genealogy Society has identified living descendants of 4 of our soldiers. They're planning to attend next month's memorial service." Michael appeared from behind the memorial building, his accountant's precision evident in the way he had organized the day's logistics. Jake walked beside his father, the 7-year-old's energy somewhat subdued by the morning's medical treatment, but his spirit undiminished by the ongoing battle with his chronic condition. The payment plan for his care was working, supplemented by a medical foundation grant that had become available when his case was featured in the story about the Memorial Center. "Everything's ready for the ceremony," Michael reported. "The folding chairs are set up, the sound system is tested, and Robert should be here any minute with the Veterans Honor Guard." Harold looked around at his family, seeing in their faces the peace that comes from having tested themselves in the crucible of impossible choices and emerged with their integrity intact. The financial struggles continued, but they were manageable struggles, the kind that families could face together without compromising their souls or betraying their values. As if summoned by their conversation, Robert's car appeared on the county road, followed by a small convoy of vehicles carrying the veterans who had volunteered to provide military honors for the dedication ceremony. Harold's eldest son had survived his business crisis through a combination of belt-tightening, creative financing, and the kind of community support that materialized when people realized that some principles were worth protecting. The ceremony itself was simple but profound, conducted in the shadow of the guardian stone, with the dignity befitting a memorial that had been over a century in the making. The Veterans' Honor Guard presented arms, a bugler played taps, and the American flag was raised over a garden that had been carefully planted to bloom. Throughout the growing season, Harold found himself standing beside the boulder where he had sat countless times with his grandfather, feeling the presence of all the Pembertons who had kept faith with sleeping soldiers through war and peace, prosperity and hardship, temptation and testing. The weight of that legacy no longer felt like a burden, but like a gift. The knowledge that some things mattered more than money, that some promises were worth keeping regardless of cost, that some choices defined who you were for all the generations that would follow. As the ceremony concluded and the visitors began to explore the memorial center, Harold remained beside the guardian stone, with Ellie perched on his knee, both of them watching the late morning light play across the moss-covered surface that had witnessed so much history and held so many secrets. "Grandpa Harold," Ellie said thoughtfully, "are the soldier boys happy now that everyone knows they're here?" Harold considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, thinking about honor and sacrifice and the long arc of justice that sometimes took more than a century to complete its work. "I think they're happy, sweetheart. I think they're finally at peace, knowing that people remember them and understand what they died for." Ellie nodded with 5-year-old satisfaction, secure in the knowledge that the right choice had been made, and the sleeping soldiers could rest easy in their honored ground. Around them, visitors moved through the memorial garden with the respectful quiet that sacred spaces inspire, reading the plaques that told the story of 7 young men who had died believing their sacrifice would mean something. Harold closed his eyes and felt the presence of his grandfather Ezra, his great-great-grandfather William, and all the Pemberton generations who had carried this secret and protected this trust. The promise had been kept, the faith had been honored, and the guardian stone would stand forever as a testament to the truth that some things were indeed worth more than money. The family had chosen honor over fortune, duty over convenience, the needs of the dead over the demands of the living, and in making that choice, they had discovered that the greatest treasures were not buried in the earth, but built into the character of people who understood that keeping faith with the past was the only way to secure the future. As the afternoon sun climbed higher and the memorial center welcomed its first day of visitors, Harold Pemberton sat beside the guardian stone with his granddaughter in his arms, surrounded by the peace that comes from knowing that when everything was at stake, his family had chosen wisely and well. Some promises were indeed worth keeping, and some stones were meant to stand forever, protecting not just the dead, but the living truth that honor mattered more than gold.